1997. WWE was losing a war. Every Monday night, millions of wrestling fans had a choice. WWE's Monday Night Raw or WCW's Monday Nitro. And for more than a year, the ratings told the story. WCW had the bigger stars, the bigger money, and the momentum. WWE was fighting for survival. Then, almost at the same time, two completely different wrestlers began changing everything. One was a rebellious brawler who hated authority. The other was a third-generation star who had been rejected by the very fans he was supposed to entertain. They weren't supposed to become the faces of WWE, but they did. And when Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock finally collided, the wrestling business would never be the same. This isn't just the story of one of the greatest rivalries of the Attitude Era. It's the story of how two unlikely stars helped pull WWE back to the top. This is the rivalry that saved WWE. In the mid-1990s, WWE wasn't the unstoppable machine we know today. It was fighting for its life. WCW had become a legitimate threat, backed by the enormous resources of Ted Turner, and Monday Nitro had become the place where many fans were tuning in every week. From June 1996 into April 1998, Nitro went on an extraordinary 83-week streak over Raw in the head-to-head ratings battle. For WWE, this wasn't just about losing television ratings. It was about losing relevance. The wrestling audience was changing. The colorful, cartoon-like heroes of the past were beginning to feel outdated. Fans wanted characters who felt dangerous, unpredictable, real. They didn't necessarily want someone to tell them who the hero was. They wanted someone they could believe in. WWE needed a new identity, and two men were about to provide it. Neither looked like the obvious answer. Neither followed the traditional path to becoming a superstar. But both were about to reinvent themselves, and that reinvention would eventually bring them face to face. Before he became Stone Cold Steve Austin, there was no guarantee that Steve Austin would become anything close to WWE's biggest star. He had talent, he had experience, but his career had already taken some brutal turns. After being released by WCW, Austin found himself in ECW, where he began developing the sharper personality that would eventually define him. Then came WWE. At first, Austin wasn't the beer-drinking anti-hero everyone remembers. He was simply another talented wrestler trying to find his place. But everything changed when he stopped trying to be what wrestling expected him to be. Austin became colder, angrier, more confrontational. He didn't want to shake hands. He didn't want to play by the rules. And most importantly, he didn't care what anyone thought about him. Then came the moment that changed his life. Austin 3:16. Suddenly, WWE had something it hadn't had before. A hero who didn't act like a hero. He wasn't polished. He wasn't obedient. He wasn't asking anyone for permission. He was the guy who would tell the boss exactly what he thought, and then hit him with a stunner. And fans loved him for it. Because Stone Cold wasn't just a wrestling character. To an audience watching in the late 1990s, he represented rebellion. He represented frustration. He represented the feeling of finally telling authority, no. But across the company, another transformation was taking place, and his story couldn't have been more different. Dwayne Johnson entered WWE with almost everything you would think a future superstar needed. The family, the pedigree, the look, the athletic ability. He was wrestling royalty, a third-generation star, and WWE gave him a name designed to make him sound like the next great hero, Rocky Maivia. There was just one problem. The fans hated him. They didn't see the next Hulk Hogan. They saw a manufactured smile, a wrestler being pushed because of his family, And instead of fighting the rejection, Rocky Maivia eventually embraced it. He stopped trying to be the hero. He became arrogant, confident, insulting, and eventually, The Rock was born. The man the audience had once rejected became one of the most charismatic performers wrestling had ever seen. And that's where the stories of Austin and Rock began to mirror each other. Austin was rejected and reinvented himself. Rock was rejected and reinvented himself. One became the ultimate anti-authority rebel. The other became the ultimate larger-than-life superstar. Two completely different personalities, two completely different paths, but both were becoming impossible to ignore. And sooner or later, they were going to collide. What made Austin and Rock different from almost every other rivalry wasn't simply that they were popular. It was that they represented opposite ideas of what a wrestling superstar could be. Austin was raw. Rock was polished. Austin was fury. Rock was swagger. Austin didn't need anyone's approval. Rock could control an arena with nothing but his presence. And when they were put together, the contrast was electric. Their rivalry reached its first WrestleMania main event level at WrestleMania XV in 1999. The Rock had become Vince McMahon's corporate champion. Austin was the rebellious challenger, and behind them was Vince McMahon, whose authority had become one of the defining forces of Austin's story. The match wasn't simply about a championship. It represented the collision of two identities that fans had become obsessed with. Austin wanted to fight the system. The Rock had become powerful enough to represent it. Austin won, but the rivalry was nowhere near finished. 2 years later, they reached the stage again, WrestleMania X-Seven, and this time, everything changed. Austin and Rock tore into each other in a match that felt like the culmination of everything the Attitude Era had become. But then came the moment nobody expected. Vince McMahon appeared, the same man Austin had spent years fighting. The same authority figure Austin had built his entire identity around opposing. And instead of rejecting him, Austin used his assistance. He used Vince's help to defeat The Rock. Then the two men stood together. The image was almost impossible to process. Stone Cold Steve Austin, standing beside Vince McMahon, the ultimate rebel, had finally crossed the line, and The Rock had been left on the other side. It wasn't just a shocking wrestling moment, it was symbolic. The character who had built his entire identity around fighting authority had finally surrendered to it. The rivalry had changed. The Attitude Era was changing with it. And while Austin and Rock were destroying each other on screen, WWE was beginning to win the larger war. WCW's 83-week streak over Raw ended in April 1998. But the war wasn't decided in a single week. The two shows continued competing through the middle of 1998. Then, in November, Raw pulled decisively ahead of Nitro, and it would not surrender that position again. The difference wasn't one wrestler. It wasn't one storyline. It wasn't one night. But Austin and Rock were at the center of the new WWE identity. They represented exactly what the changing audience wanted. Characters who weren't clean, heroes who weren't perfect, villains who could become heroes, and stories where you couldn't always predict what would happen next. That unpredictability became one of WWE's greatest weapons. Austin could be a hero one night and make a decision that shocked everyone the next. Rock could be hated, loved, booed, cheered, and still somehow remain the biggest personality in the building. They didn't fit neatly into good versus evil. They were bigger than that. And while WWE surged, WCW struggled to keep pace. By 2001, WCW was gone as a major competitor, its assets purchased by WWE. The Monday Night War was over, and WWE had survived. But Austin and Rock weren't finished writing their story. Their rivalry would eventually reach one final WrestleMania. WrestleMania XIX, March 30th, 2003. The Rock defeated Stone Cold Steve Austin. But the result wasn't the most important part. Because this wasn't simply another chapter in their rivalry. The man who had once represented everything rebellious about WWE was walking away, and standing across from him was The Rock. The man who had once been rejected as Rocky Maivia. Two men who had started from completely different places had arrived at the same destination. The Rock won, and Austin's era inside the ring was over. But their rivalry had already accomplished something much bigger than a win or a loss. They had become the defining faces of an era. Today, Rock versus Austin isn't remembered simply because they had great matches. It's remembered because of what happened when you put them together. Austin showed wrestling that an anti-hero could become its biggest attraction. The Rock showed that charisma could turn a rejected character into a global superstar. And together, they helped WWE discover a new identity at the exact moment the company needed one. They didn't single-handedly win the Monday Night War. No two wrestlers could. But they became two of the most important pieces of the WWE machine that eventually emerged victorious. And that's what makes their rivalry so special. It wasn't just two men fighting over a championship. It was two completely different visions of what a wrestling superstar could be, colliding at exactly the right moment. One man was the rebel. The other was the showman. One fought authority. The other became the authority of the microphone. And somehow, both became legends. Stone Cold and The Rock didn't just have one of wrestling's greatest rivalries. They helped define an entire generation. And when the dust finally settled, WWE was still standing. The war was over, and the two men who had once been rivals had become immortal. Two men, one company, one war, and a rivalry that changed wrestling forever. Because WWE would spend years searching for another rivalry like this one, and that's where the next chapter begins.